Hello, I'm Robin Gregory. Home is Vancouver, Canada, where I teach and do research and applied work in risk policy and stakeholder engagement. I've been doing this work for the past 40 years or so, and I've been asked today to share some of the insights I've learned and to talk a bit about what works and what doesn't work. So, an outline for what I'll be covering today, talk a bit about definition of risk consultations, their purpose, the importance of how the problem is framed, which is a place where you, as a facilitator, analyst, have a very important role to play. Talk about some of the misconceptions about risk consultations, and then get into some practical considerations, special cases depending on who you're working with, and then just follow up with a few readings and one concluding slide. So essentially, consultation or engagement, I'll use those two words as meaning essentially the same thing. You're eliciting input to help whoever the decision makers are make better decisions about risk issues. And sometimes those decision makers will be actually the group you're working with. Sometimes you'll have input from your group, which will go forward to the decision makers. Essentially, you're involving and informing potentially affected people. It's both a science, because you have to fit the consultation approach you use to the context and to the participants. It's also an art, because you cannot predict all the factors at play, and there's numerous ways in which uncertainty enters. So some of the kinds of issues you will deal with as a consultation expert are within your control, some are not within your control. But the basic promise you make to the people you work with is that you listen to them, you talk when you need to talk, when some leadership is required or some guidance is required. But the most important thing you do is listen. You listen to the views, you listen to the concerns, you listen to what matters from the people who are potentially affected by an action. And as consultation lead, you need to be value neutral. You're not steering the consultation in one direction or another. You're not looking for certain outcomes. Talk a bit more about this later on. But you're really wanting to hear what the concerns are that the potentially affected people have, and then try to work with them and work with the clients to develop the best action, the best project. But even if you do a terrific job in a consultation, there's no guarantee that everything will work out. No guarantee that stakeholders will cooperate and decide to trust you. No guarantee that experts will be providing you with accurate information. No guarantee that the decision makers will necessarily cooperate and keep their word. And you've always got the external events. What's happening with the weather, what's happening with other regions, other countries, other actors. So whatever choice and insight comes out of your process could always be undermined by some external process over which you have no control. What is now done with risk consultations, sort of conventional approaches, individual interviews with key informants, small group discussions, try to work with representative groups. That necessarily involves a smaller number of people as compared to large sample opinion surveys, which can get thousands or hundreds of people involved, town hall meetings, large meetings where you might go into a community and have 200 or 300 people show up and give you their thoughts about something, and formal hearings, other quasi-legal forums. How well are these working? Everyone would disagree. I would say they're working moderately well, but there's a lot of room for improvement, which I think is one of the purposes of this talk. A lot of challenges with conventional approaches. Individual interviews, a small number of people. Often the selection of individuals is biased, and this is a place where you, as a facilitator analyst, can start to get involved. If the people that you're asked to speak with only represent one view, sort of controlled by special interests, you want to fight back against that, because you want to hear a representative views from all the range of people who might be affected by an action. Small group discussions. Again, who picks the people? If you have a small group, are they representative, or do you work with a number of small groups, perhaps a technical group, perhaps a government group, perhaps some public group, perhaps an Indigenous group, and then part of your job will be to put this whole package together. Opinion surveys often are dominated by emotional responses and often don't provide enough room to really go into depth in the different issues. So you can end up with superficial responses, really guided by that initial affective emotional response. Town hall meetings, they can be great in terms of hearing from a lot of different people, but there isn't much opportunity really for dialogue. You mostly listen, people come and talk, and in my experience, often the loudest voices win, and people often bring up other subjects that are outside of the bounds of what you're supposed to be doing in your consultation. And then there are formal hearings, which can work well, but often involve biased or overconfident experts, and often it's a more adversarial forum. So it's hard to get people to work together because you often have sort of warring sides. So what do you do with this? Who solves these problems? And essentially you do. Your job as the analyst or facilitator leading the consultation process is to have some input, work with the client, work with the decision makers to try to achieve what you feel would be the best consultation forum or engagement forum for addressing the problem. There's also a lot of newer methods which have a lot of promise, also have some issues. Social media, widely used today, particularly in some other continents outside of North America. You can also use traditional media, newspapers, radio, TV, journals, magazines. It's a great way to get out the message and communicate with a wider group of people. Working with small, diverse, truly representative groups, as long as you adapt to the situation and local cultures, they can provide a lot of important insight to what matters in terms of proposed actions. Natural reasoning surveys, I'll give an example later on, which try to follow how people actually think and provide an opportunity to also have tutorials, which can provide information. Multi-method groups, where you might have 3 or 4 different things going on at once, interviews, small groups, larger surveys, and the output from all of these not only informs each other, interviews informing the small groups informing the larger surveys, but then all this input goes forward to the decision makers. And also deliberative polling is one of the newer methods where you, either using the internet or in person, opinions are expressed, but then they're accompanied by dialogue. So you have more of a back and forth, which can be very helpful in some cases. But you always need to think about how people really think about risk, because it's not just with our brains, it's not just a cognitive matter, we also use our feelings, we use our emotions, we use our intuitions. So essentially humans, men and women, all of us, old and young, technically trained, little education from all cultures, we are not the rational decision makers that some people would like to think that we are. Instead, we use a variety of shortcuts to help navigate our choices. And there's a very rich literature on this, but basically we all anchor on initial impressions, don't always have sufficient adjustment later on. We're strongly influenced by recent inputs and events. It's a tendency in many people to be myopic. We overrate the short term and we discount the longer term. So we look at what might occur in the next weeks or months or just a few years in advance. It's easy to forget the consequences of an action maybe a decade or 2 or 3 on down the line. So future generations, even unborn generations, often can be very important to include in the consultation, even though they're not there in person. Sunk costs, it's easy to over-rely on what already has been done, so you're sort of married to or give extra credence to something that already has been done, money already spent, construction already completed, even though it might not really make sense going forward. And overconfident. People tend to be overconfident, everyone, including consultation leads and facilitation leads, thinking we know more than we really do. So there are ways of working to overcome all of these biases. Talk a bit more about that. So we're not always rational or consistent in our risk judgments. We have 2 modes of thinking, a faster and a slower, a more intuitive, a more reflective. Part of what this means is that we also tend to be selective in gathering data. We look for confirming evidence. We look for evidence that's going to confirm our existing views, and we tend to ignore contradictory data. We model our decisions after those in our groups, so we really care a lot about peer influence. It's not easy to think about uncertainty and probabilities Even though anytime we think about risk, we have to think about uncertainty and probabilities. And part of your job as the consultation analyst, the consultation facilitator, may be working with people, helping people to think about problems in terms of uncertainty and probabilities. And it's not always easy to listen to different points of view and then adopt your views, or getting people within a group to adopt their views to reflect these new points of view. So I'm dividing the talk into different parts. Second part, I want to talk about different types of consultation, framing the risk issue, and I want to get to some examples so we move from the abstract to the more concrete. Number of different purposes of consultation. Part of your job, again, is to work with the clients, work with the decision makers, and think about what it is you're doing. So starting from really insufficient consultation, you might not even call it consultation, one-way communication through speakers, websites, posters, tutorials, really where all you're trying to do is inform or educate. So it's very much one way. There isn't much consultation or engagement going on. Simple consultation is eliciting sort of one-way feedback, focus group surveys, meetings, but it's insufficient if you're dealing with more complex issues. If you really involve people, you engage in two-way dialogue. And I think now we're starting to get into the actual heart of consultation or engagement. Use meetings, workshop results, plans are being adapted, modified based on what you're hearing in the group. So it really is a much more active working with what matters to people and then trying to carry this through to what's being done in an action or what's being proposed. Collaborative processes is where you're working together with those who might be affected to generate new ideas, new alternatives. So it's really much more of a partnership as you move into empowering, creating partners, proponents of plans, and they can have a continuing role in decision-making in governments. They may have veto power over what goes on. They may be essentially managers for a plant that's being constructed, or managers for some kind of resource action in the future. So really empowering those you work with to be active partners and proponents of the different plans. And I think generally over time, over the last, say, 2 or 3 decades, we've been moving in the consultation facilitation world more from the first couple, informing or consulting, seeing the importance now of much more collaboration, much more empowering of those we're working with. Your role is to be value-free, to be transparent. Let participants know what to expect. Who's funding you? Are you going to be biased, have motivational biases because of whoever is funding your work on the consultation? How many meetings should they expect? What do you anticipate in terms of their role? And what will happen with the results? Is it really worth people's time to come and work with you, give up a free afternoon, time with their families, whatever they're giving up to come and participate in the process? It's also important to outline very clearly the consultation process you'll follow. You need to be flexible, you need to co-design or adapt based on the needs of participants. But again, people should know what they're getting into. You can't expect people to sign up for 3 meetings or 8 meetings, whatever it is, unless they have some pretty good idea that it will be worth their while. Sometimes people also will be paid. Sometimes also people may get, free lunches, free dinners, daycare, things like that, that again will make it more interesting and easier for them to come and participate. And always remember your objective is not to necessarily to reach consensus, not to get everyone to agree on one single way of looking at a problem, but to provide insight to decision makers so the best decision can be made. Consultation methods, we'll be talking more about specific methods, but they need to vary with the issues and the context. There's never one size fits all. This is what has kept someone like myself interested over 4 decades in working in consultation, because even with a lot of experience, every issue is different, every group of participants is different. And certainly working with local issues, national issues, international issues, you have to adjust what you're doing, and it's a learning experience. So no matter how much experience you have, no matter how many groups you've run, you have to address each new group, the next group, as being an opportunity for you to learn as well as for the participants to learn. Framing is how the consultation problem is defined. There's always lots of ways of looking at a problem. It's like looking at a building, and you can look from the north, south, east, or west and get different views. It's the same kind of thing when you're looking at a consultation problem. You, working with decision makers, probably working with participants as well, need to think about what's the scope, what issues are on or off the table, what's included in the consultation process. Are you looking at economic and environmental impacts and leaving out things like social and cultural, spiritual, mental health effects? How will these be dealt with? Will they be dealt with? Are you looking just at direct effects, or what about indirect effects? What about long-term effects? What about cumulative effects, where other projects happening perhaps in the same region might have an effect on the particular project you're looking at? What about effects on special populations? Children, the elderly, maybe disabled people. Will these be given special priority? Do you have resources and funding to provide that extra consultation work? And how are you going to be dealing with uncertainty? So going back to the earlier slide about informing, empowering, consulting, what's the purpose of the consultations? Who will be involved? What interests are considered legitimate? Are there some people who might want to be involved that will be excluded because you or the decision makers or others consider their views not legitimate for this particular problem? And what is it that you expect the consultation participants to do? Are they actually making decisions or only recommendations? If decisions are being made by others, what kind of guarantee can you provide to participants? Can you provide any guarantees that their recommendations actually will be followed? So it's a place where you need to be very honest as a facilitator, as an engagement lead. So first example from the 1990s, I was asked, along with a colleague, Ralph Keeney, to lead a consultation project in Sabah, Malaysia. The question was whether a remote area of Sabah should be developed to mine thermal coal, or should it be preserved as a pristine rainforest. And this is the way the question was given to us. The framing was, it's an either-or question. Do A or do B, the mine versus preservation. And our response was really, before we even went to Sabah and led the workshop, was, is it possible to reframe this as a continuum? Thinking of development and preservation as bookends, but perhaps there's a lot of intermediate options that exist. And that did turn out to be a good way of looking at it, and it broke a long-term deadlock and provided a lot of opportunities. So what we were asked to do was convene, with help from local government, a representative group of people covering 6 or 7 different types of interests and concerns, about 30 people in total. We started by asking what matters about this area. What's most important to you in terms of possible changes? And we just made a list. So we ended up with over 100 different kinds of concerns that people had in terms of whichever alternative happened, mining or preservation, what might change, what concerned people, what mattered to people. We then arranged these into 5 different categories, shifting from essentially positions that people had into interests or values, which is a basic set of lessons from negotiation sciences. We then looked at different alternatives, tried to work with the group and work with outside experts to see how the key values might be impacted by different actions. The main reframing insight is really, well, do we have to just look at these bookends? What about something else? We looked at where the best mining areas are, where the best preservation or most important preservations are. Turned out there are different areas, different regions within this larger area. So reframing the problem based on participants' values and saying perhaps the mining, even a different type of mining, could happen over here, preservation could happen over in this other area, actually led to a bit of a win-win and a reframing of the problem, which led to new insights and broader agreement within the group. Second example, a more recent example, rather than being a small group, used a survey, a public survey of 1,800 people to look at to provide information to decision makers about public support for geoengineering options, options such as carbon removal versus solar reflection, as a way of dealing with climate change. So working with a larger group, enables population comparisons. So because we had 1,800 completed surveys, we could then say, what about men versus women? What about older versus younger? What about urban versus rural? And so that informed that result, those results informed smaller follow-up groups as well. And usually in a sample, like our sample size was 1,800, I think we had somewhere around 1,000 people who actually completed the survey. So that's pretty usual. You get 50 or 60% of fully completed surveys. But it still allows you to do this decomposition and to look more deeply at different groups. We also, because this survey mirrored the way that people think about risk issues, started with values, but then moved on to tutorials to fill information gaps. And you can adjust these tutorials based on how people respond to prior questions in the survey. This was done over the internet. And that helps to overcome misinformation and provide more accurate information, provide a more consistent information base for people in the groups. So working, if you have an explicit decision context, get people to declare their policy objectives. This also then allows you to think about what are some of the key trade-offs? Where are some of the real key sticking points? Sometimes seeing these set out allows people to also revise their opinions and provides good information for decision makers. And I wanted to show this slide because this is one of the outputs from this national survey. And it just provides information to decision makers about what should be done. Should we continue existing policies? Should we test new ideas? Should we do more? Should we not do more? And the different levels of concern of different people. Third problem, really a worldwide problem, is artificial intelligence and automation. You may well be familiar with the fact that over the next decade, technology is developing to permit increasing use of driver-assisted or driverless vehicles. It's already happening. So societies around the world need to decide, and quite quickly, do the benefits of driver-assisted or driverless vehicles, do the benefits outweigh the risk? Is this a technology we even want? If so, why? What about responsibilities to out-of-work employees? Who's going to be in charge? Very difficult issue, and in my opinion, the decision should not be left to the people developing the artificial intelligence or developing the technologies, but you should have public input, and there should be a public policy decision dealing with the public risk issues. So it's very important to deal with some of these trade-offs. And I'll leave this one with you. You can think about this later on. Suppose you are placed in charge of a national initiative to consult with citizens. What's the purpose? How do you frame the consultation process? What do you anticipate will be benefits, costs, risks? That's key to identifying the stakeholders that you would consider legitimate, those who should be involved. How do you deal with uncertainty? How do you deal with emotions? Driverless vehicles is quite an emotional issue. So how do you get people to combine that more emotional response, but also with the information and more sort of accurate reflection of what the promise and the perils of driverless vehicles could be? And what role should be the role of government? Who makes the decisions? Private sector, government? What role does your group have in the recommendations that your group actually makes? So think about it. This may well be something that you at some point are asked to work on. I also wanted to talk some about the misconceptions about risk consultations, sort of excuses that sometimes are made for not doing the best job. And again, as facilitator analyst, it's good to anticipate that some of these reasons, these misconceptions may appear so that you're ready to argue back against them. Part of your job is to try to ensure that the best risk consultation process is followed. So first misconception is that effective consultations encourage public involvement, but really good decisions, good risk decisions, only rely on science. And this is one of the things I've heard often here. It aggravates me. I always argue against it. The reason is that science does not make decisions, and scientists are not free of the biases we talked about earlier, anchoring, availability, overconfidence, etc., because science itself is informed by values. What to look at, what data is valid, how to analyze that data. Those are all questions where scientists themselves are basing their decisions on values, not just on science. So it's also important to remember that helpful information comes from outside conventional science. We may have excellent observations using the best science, just different scientific models from local resource users or from Indigenous knowledge. So consultations always involve both factual information and values information. So if you're looking at something like emissions exposure, sure, turn to scientific experts for that. But if you want to know what matters, that's a values question, and a different group will provide that information, or involve scientists too and ask them what matters to them, but make sure you ask other groups and get other points of view as well. Second misconception. Often hear that we want to involve everyone. We want to be inclusive. That's what public consultation is. It should be inclusive. We want everyone's views to be heard. My heart says that's a good way to go, but there are trade-offs involved. If you want an inclusive process, you often leave insufficient time for all stakeholders to make their views known. So you're asking people to perhaps participate in a process, but maybe only giving them 10 or 15 minutes. If this is the issue is something very much foundational to people's lives, in a way it's an insult to say, come, talk to us, travel, give us your time, give us your energy, but you only have 10 minutes to provide that input. It's not really a good way to gain trust. It's not really a good way to learn in any sort of depth about what the problem is. So if the goal is hearing from all citizens, you can do that, but you're likely to hear only superficial concerns, and some of what you hear will not really reflect the views of informed citizens. Another thing that's difficult if you're trying to be inclusive is it's very hard to provide interaction or questioning of views. Often you learn a lot if experts, members of a panel, members of a quasi-judicial process have time to go back and forth and interact and question either other experts or question members of the public. Also, a lot can be learned if different members of the public get to go back and forth. For example, in the Saba group I talked about earlier, a lot of really useful information was gained when the pro-mining groups could talk with the pro-environmental protection groups, and they learned a lot from each other and actually ended up finding out that many of their values were much the same. Many of the foundational values were much the same. And finally, if you want an inclusive process, it's not a level playing field, and that tends to favor the more powerful groups, those with more funding, those with more resources, and it can work to the disadvantage of more marginal groups. Third misconception is that we can't really do a good consultation process because it would take too long. We don't have time. Again, as the facilitator, as the analyst, this is something you should argue against because good collaborative processes are flexible and engagement can be done to fit a defined time frame. You can have a lot of good engagement over a weekend workshop. And if you have a longer process, you sometimes hear that, oh, we had a great consultation process that lasted 3 months, or a great consultation process that lasted 2 years. The length of time, essentially the quantity of consultation, is no guarantee of success. You can have a lousy process that lasts 2 years. You can have a great process that lasts 2 years. And same way, you can have a weekend workshop which leads to great insights for decision makers about what matters to people and what information gaps exist that need to be further explored, or you could have a very unsuccessful, unhelpful 2-day workshop. Also, without a good consultation approach, it may take much longer to reach agreement. So that's one of the things as a facilitator analyst you can argue back to those saying, we don't have time to do it right. You can say, of course we have time to do it right. We just have to work out a different context and do what's right over the time and with the resources we have. Sometimes also there's low-hanging fruit, obvious things that everyone agrees on which can be implemented quickly. Other parts of the consultation process can then continue and may take longer, in particular addressing some important information gaps. You might hear that a good consultation process is too expensive. Again, something that decision makers may say as an excuse for not doing things right. The answer to that is really that good risk consultation processes don't have to be expensive, in part because if you really focus on the decision context, if you learn how to frame the problem, and if you learn what values are important, what really matters in that context, that limits discussions to and limits information collection to the areas that really are important. If you don't have that initial decision context framing, clarification of values process, you can end up wasting a whole lot of money looking at things that really aren't helpful for this decision. They may be helpful for other reasons. They may expand the realm of scientific knowledge, but they might not be helpful in terms of making this particular decision, and that's your job, that's your focus, is the particular decision that's on the table. You also really want to make sure that the discussions are kept to legitimate interests, whose interests are at stake, and again, to those key considerations. So by doing that, you help build trust. Building trust can also mean that the risk consultation can unfold more quickly and end up overall costing less money. Another thing you might hear is that the management problem is too complex for public input. It's going to be too hard for people to understand. This is one that makes me, brings my own emotional anger up. Experts are no smarter than the public. They're trained in different ways. Can a doctor fix his toilet? Everyone knows things that other people don't know. And thankfully, intelligence is pretty reasonably spread across the population. Most complex decisions can also be broken down into understandable parts. So if you're leading a group, consultation group, facilitation group, if you're leading a group and something is not understandable, that's on you. It's not on the participants, it's not on the problem. Your job, part of your job, is to make sure that things are understandable. And if you can't do that, then get someone else in to help you, to help explain whatever that issue is. And you also can develop a lot of scales to incorporate values that are harder to define. Culture, environmental health, prestige. These don't have easy measurements, easy metrics, the way that jobs or revenues do, but you can look at the different options, look at the different alternatives, and compare them in terms of actions or alternatives that have more or less beneficial or adverse effect on culture, on environmental health, on prestige of a community. So all those things, all those more intangible values can be brought into the picture. Also, balancing the pros and cons of different options always requires value judgments. And so if you can set up the consultation in a way so that there is a base level of understanding, then you can really get those value judgments from an informed population. And the last misconception is it's sort of useless to do any kind of consultation because you can't really get an informed citizenry given the polarization of the group, misinformation and disinformation. So you want to find ways and work with decision makers, work with local people, perhaps work with media experts to try to develop a good base understanding through tutorials, through exposure to different experts. Perhaps you need to bring in different experts who the different participants will trust to try to provide that common information base. So you won't get everybody agreeing on their values, but ideally you will get everybody agreeing on the relevant factual information. So it's not just up to you and the decision makers to select, for example, inputs to come in and help inform participants. It's up to the participants themselves. Get people that participants trust, and it's much more likely that they in fact will believe what people are saying. Also, when you invite experts, you don't necessarily need the most famous experts, but get experts who can speak clearly, respond to questions, who are willing to engage in that kind of dialogue with participants. If you're setting up a survey and are using tutorials, make sure you use common language. Test it out in advance. Provide sources for people to go for more information, and provide some guidance for later internet searches. What sites provide accurate information and which do not. So a few more practical consultation tips. Working with participants, it's essential that you remember, and I noted this earlier, every consultation is unique. I find every consultation challenging. Having worked in this area for a long time, I still come with a sense of excitement, a bit of anxiety, a bit of nervousness. Will I be able to do a good job this time? What do I need to know? What do I need to learn? Who do I need to speak with before starting the consultation? What sort of a base level of understanding do I need to develop in myself? And it's also important to match the consultation process to the issues and the people involved. If I don't have that knowledge, then I can reach out. I can reach out to colleagues, perhaps other colleagues in Canada or North America, but also it's a worldwide network now. So via email, Zoom, phone conversations, I have a whole world of people, and I can search for people who perhaps have had prior experience, which I may lack, in this particular context, who know about this special technological development or know about some of the special issues that are coming up. So that's part of your homework that's good for you to do before you actually reach your first group. Also, good consultation requires a knowledge of history. What has happened previously? Have other attempts been made to develop consultation processes? Have they failed? Have they worked? How has, if you're working for the government, how has the government dealt with this same issue in the past? So what are you walking into? Are you going to walk into a group of people who don't know much about the issue, or are you walking into a group of people who may have a lot of anger, may have a lot of resentment, who may have trust, who may not have trust? That's part of your homework, to know this. And even then, given your homework, given experience, you need to be very flexible in your approach. And you'll need to make adjustments as you learn more about the people, the topic, the impacts. And you'll need to make adjustments as you learn more about the decision makers. How well do they listen to you? How much do they really want to hear about what's coming from your small group or your town meetings or your surveys? So it's a very interesting balance. It's, in a sense, a science that you are doing based on different ways of trying to work with people and get that information. And going back to that earlier slide about empowering, consulting, different ways of actually leading a consultation process. But you also need to be flexible and be humble about how much you know, and realize also that for you, this may be a consultation job. You may have been hired to do this work, but for the people in the room, it may be their livelihood. It may be their home that's at stake, their job that's at stake, their family history, which is in the balance. So you owe it to them to do the best job you possibly can. Who should lead the consultation? Like, what kind of skills do you need as the lead? You need to be able to facilitate, to work well with participants, know when to talk, when to listen, when to be patient, when to set limits. You need to know something about the analysis. You need to be familiar with the plans, proposals. You need to know how data is going to be used. You need to know something about some of the key information gaps. So you don't need to be a factual expert. You can bring in other people with more technical knowledge, but you need to know enough about the context, about the risk issue, about what may be planned for an area, so that you can ask good questions of those experts and help guide those discussions. You also need to speak to power. You know how the results will be used. You need to be realistic and be honest with people in the group about what that consultation can accomplish. Will they actually be decision makers, or are they simply informing another group about what may be realistic, what matters, what should be done? So the participants will count on you to represent their views faithfully, to be honest, and not to waste their time. This is something where in some groups it comes pretty easily. In other groups you have to work very, very hard to earn the trust of the people in the room, or to make sure that you in fact are fully representing the views of people. Sometimes it requires meeting with some groups, some people, outside of the formal consultations. Go and have a dinner with people, go and have some coffees with people, whatever it takes, so that you can actually build up some of those more positive relationships. How do you decide on your role? Should you be doing this yourself? Do you need other people? I often work with at least one other person where either myself or the other person might lead. The other person will take notes, interject, track important questions. So I think it's very, very often useful to have two people leading, not one. You have to decide how you're going to bring in factual information, and you have to decide how you'll communicate results. How should you disseminate findings, assuming they're not confidential? Written reports to clients, verbal reports, film documentaries, stories on radio, social media, etc. Lots of different ways to get out the message from the group. And I've mentioned trust quite a few times. If there is a prior history where the group's experience, the group you're working with, has been positive, or where a previous survey has been done and the results were really useful, then that makes your job easier. If the prior history has been difficult, then that makes your job quite a bit harder. And that may be a real focus for the first couple sessions, is to try to rebuild that trust that's been lost. What about the topic of the conversation? Is it highly emotionally charged? Is it something that people really perhaps feel angry about or worried about? You need to take that essentially and run with it. You need to recognize that that's in the room. Don't try to pretend it isn't there. Don't try to pretend that it's just a cognitive conversation you're having. But you need to find ways to allow people to express that emotionality, find out what's behind it, and then try to build solutions, try to build resolution of that into the different kinds of alternatives or actions that you recommend. Even prior experience with consultation leaders. Have they had previous good experiences or bad experiences with somebody who's in your capacity? And realize that if you don't have very long, if you're working over four groups over a month, or perhaps even over a weekend or over a day, there's much less time to build trust. So one of the things that I often do if I'm working in a new community is I will meet with some of the leaders in the community, a mayor or a chief of an Indigenous nation, or some of the lead scientists if it's a technical group. I'll meet with them first, and then when I actually physically walk into a room, I'll walk in with them, and I'll make sure that they know something about me, something about my prior experience, so that there's an element of trust there. And in a sense, if they trust the person I walk in the room with, it's easier for them to eventually trust me. You need to respect different cultural contexts, who will be involved, who makes decisions. Different groups make decisions in different ways. Some groups are very democratic, some groups have sort of a single person. Sometimes there's oversight, sometimes there's public votes. You need to adjust what you're doing and involve people differently depending on the cultural context. So in some cases, my groups have had a good mix of men and women. Sometimes they're mostly men, sometimes they're mostly women, older, younger people. Sometimes it's essential to involve religious leaders or politicians. Sometimes religious leaders and politicians wouldn't really feel comfortable with the particular context. So you need to adjust to the problem and to the particular culture you're in, and realize that you may know much less than you'd like to know about that cultural context. So work with people from that area, work with people from that group, or work with people from that region so that you and help set up a consultation process that actually works for the people in that community. It's also important to think, is the decision a one-time choice, or is it something where maybe there'll be an annual or a sequence choice? So the decision that you're making now could have an effect on something that will need to be decided in a year or two. Sometimes you're making a decision for a certain period of time, like running a hydroelectric plant. Water flows may be decided over a 2-year period, over a 5-year period. So you're really setting up a longer-term process where every 5 years or every 2 years, there'll be another consultation with other kinds of decisions. Last of these sort of practical tips, how do you know when the consultation is completed? It may be something that's set externally, local or international deadlines, maybe weather, budget. There may be other influences that set a formal context that you know going in. There may be an informal context that sets when the consultation is completed. There may be an election date, and you want to make sure that you finish the consultation. Your client wants to make sure you finish the consultation before that election occurs, so that you're working with leaders who are informed, or judges or political elected officials who are informed. It may be that you have to pause the consultation for a while because people within the community are going fishing, or people in the community are not healthy, and there's no reason to try to lead the group if some of the key people can't be present. And as a facilitator, you also learn when has sufficient time been spent on the deliberation with getting a group working together, so you're really as close to agreement as the group will get. So a warning, and I've hinted at this all along, most consultations are well-intentioned, really decision makers seeking input, but some consultations are not. So beware of what I'm calling sham consultations. Some decision makers just want to check off a regulatory box. They want to set up a consultation to confirm a pre-existing view, or just to give more power to those already powerful, perhaps including themselves. And here I think you need to have knowledge and courage to argue and respectfully fight back on behalf of the potentially affected populations, whether they're current or future generations, and try to argue on behalf of a really solid consultation process. And if you're not successful, don't take on the job. So some special settings: engaging with technical experts. Remember, when you're working with technical experts, engineers, biologists, scientists, for example, they may not be aware that their opinions are subjective, depend on values, and they tend to be overconfident and not necessarily sufficiently flexible in terms of adjusting their views for what's being learned. As an example, a project I had several years ago, engaging with technical experts on the relicensing of a hydroelectric dam, decision makers, U.S. Congress, Canadian Parliament, provincial government, it was should this set of hydroelectric plants be run differently to reduce the risk to an endangered fish species and to reduce adverse effects on local indigenous community and tourism. And this is a decade-long problem. I was working with a colleague, Graham Long, and we worked with a group of experts and helped them really answer the question, what research is needed to help lower the extinction risk to this fish species? Decisions had been put off because of insufficient information, so our job was to help focus the research, working with this technical group, to help really bring more understanding to this question: what are the key hypotheses that could lead to more information about reducing the risk to the fish species? So we worked with the group, we tried to prioritize and sequence management and research actions, and really clarify the confidence of this group in the ability of new research to reduce uncertainty. And it worked well. We met with the group 5 or 6 times, and at the end of the project we had to find a way to present results so that they could easily be understood. And this is what we came up with, this kind of visual source, which is often really good. So we had a more lengthy report, but this is sort of what went forward and what we used as a basis for talking with decision makers. The x-axis is looking at the importance of research actions, the importance ratings. The y-axis is looking at scientists' confidence that an action will actually succeed, that it could be successful. So you'll see up at the right-hand corner, you have what we really needed. We know it's important, we're pretty certain it'll succeed. It doesn't really need more research. Let's just do those things. That's the low-hanging fruit, because it's important and we're fairly certain it'll work. Whereas on the left-hand side, things are really low importance, so it's a low research priority, whereas the bottom right-hand corner, we're calling those the likely guilty ones. That's the highest research priority because there's very little certainty about them, but they could be very important in terms of protecting this endangered species. So this kind of visual representation is often very helpful, or some other version, often very helpful in terms of informing decision makers and facilitating the kinds of insight and discussion that's needed. Engaging with indigenous populations is another really important area that I think is getting a lot more attention, finally, all around the world. 500 million indigenous populations worldwide. Common reasons for engaging with indigenous populations: fossil fuel production, mining, pipelines, hydroelectric dams. It's important for you as a facilitator, consultant, is to remember that decision-making and governance within indigenous communities may be conducted very differently. So you need to find out what traditional practices may be in jeopardy and how can you adjust the consultation process to the decision-making and governance followed within the indigenous communities. So how do you set up dialogue? How do you respect practices of a group? And then how do you represent cultural and social concerns? And important cases have been happening, for example, in Canada, where even after federal approval of an environmental impact assessment for a proposed pipeline that would have run across Western Canada to an ocean port, This was overturned, this approval of the federal government was overturned by a court of appeal, saying that Canada offered only a, and I quote, brief, hurried, and inadequate opportunity to exchange and discuss information and dialogue. And as a result, the approval was overturned, the project died, and there now have been changes to the Canadian Federal Impact Assessment Guidelines designed to improve consultations with First Nations. Again, the impetus for this was an inadequate consultation process. Engaging with elected officials, key decision makers often have set agendas. So they may see consultation requirements as an impediment. They may stress that they're constrained, time, resources, other demands. They may often think in terms of short-term outcomes. So you need to recognize, you need to be the one who fights for the best consultation process possible. You also need to recognize that whoever sets the agenda, whoever sets the scope and frames the consultation problem, they're the ones who hold the power. And part of your job is to make sure that the participants, those potentially affected by an action, that they have a say in setting the agenda, setting the scope. Often a good way to do it is to meet with officials early, the decision makers early, and bring them to meetings. Bring them to meetings so that they can see the robustness and the richness of the consultation process. And with the general public, that's a very nebulous term. What does general public mean? Does that include marginalized groups? Does that include the elderly? Does that involve youth? And remember also that the general public shows, in many cases, a lower average education level, but be careful of the assumptions you make. Years of education is not necessarily a good indicator of intelligence or persistence, and that local expertise that the public will hold can be really essential. These are often the people with long-term experience of changes. You need to get that factual information and those values into your consultation process. So something I always try to do is take advantage of opportunities to walk around, walk with citizens, see things through their eyes, maybe spend a couple days in the area either as part of the consultation or prior to the consultation so that you actually have some in-place information. Also look at visual ways, films, documentaries, graphs, social media, YouTube, personal testimonies as ways of you finding out more about what's going on and what matters, and also passing on information to decision makers. So quick conclusion, thinking about risk policy consultations, which as I say, they're still fun for me after all this time. They're challenging, they can be frustrating. Your job is really to make them useful and to provide decision makers with the best insights you can about the values and the facts that are relevant to their decisions. Framing the risk problem carefully, remembering that every topic, every set of participants is different and unique. You need to be flexible in your approach. Go in with a good idea of what you think you're going to do, but adapt as you learn. And you'll learn from the topic, you'll learn from the participants, and some of the endpoints may also shift. There may be more funding available partway through. There may be less time than you think you're going to have. So you have to be flexible as you go through. Be values focused, learn what matters to those who might be impacted. Use deliberation, dialogue, analysis to ensure that participants can express their views. Deliberation necessitates a back and forth, and that's part of your job, is to encourage that respectful back and forth, either between members of a group, between members of the group and decision makers, between outside experts and members of a group. Be clear about the goal of the consultation. Is it to inform? Is it to consult? Is it to involve, collaborate, empower? And as much as you can, tend to move a consultation process away from informing towards much more of a collaboration, much more of a empowering process, much more of a partnership. Be honest about power. What happens to the results? How much clout, how much power does this group really have? Know when to talk and lead, know when you need to be assertive, know when you need to really step in and help guide the discussion, and know when really you need to sit back, you need to listen, and you need to learn, and be very realistic about what's possible. And I also want to provide some follow-up readings. I've mentioned most of these or given examples of these all the way through. There's some terrific work that's been done in this area, I would urge you to check out these readings and follow things up. And I thank you very much for this opportunity and hope that it's been helpful and useful. Thank you.